How scary was it when you caught on fire on your way to the ring?
Yeah, that was pretty hairy. Potentially could have been far worse than what it actually was. A lot of things happened just by chance that night. Backstory, 2 weeks prior, I have Kevin Dunn.
I almost died. That is what was going through the mind of the most feared man in the history of professional wrestling. Not in a film, not in a stunt, not during some dramatic scene designed to make an audience gasp. In the middle of a real ring, in front of thousands of people, under a burning sky in Saudi Arabia. The year was 2019. The man was Mark Calaway. The world knew him as The Undertaker. And in that one terrible moment, the Deadman nearly became a headline of an entirely different kind. Not a legend, a tragedy. Both men were already in trouble before the match even started. The heat in Jeddah was over 100 degrees. The jet lag from the long international journey had slowed their reactions and clouded their thinking. And Goldberg had already walked face first into a ring post earlier that same evening. He was concussed before the opening bell rang. None of this stopped the match. This was the old school. You showed up, you worked, you finished. That was the rule, no exceptions. And then Goldberg went to lift the 300-pound Undertaker off the ground in a power move called the jackhammer. He lost his grip, and he dropped Mark Calaway directly onto his head and neck. The neck compressed under the full weight of his own body slamming down. The visual was horrifying to anyone who understood what they were seeing. The margin between what happened that night and a life-altering paralysis was, by his own admission, non-existent. After the match, he sat quietly back and asked himself if he still belonged in that ring. Not in an emotional, dramatic sense, in an honest, physical sense. And that question had a quiet answer that had been building for 30 years. If this kind of story hits you hard and you want to see more, go ahead and give this video some hype right now. Hit that button. It helps more than you know, and it keeps this kind of content alive. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Back to the man who made the world believe he could not be hurt. And back to the story of exactly what that belief actually cost him over 3 decades. For 30 years, The Undertaker stood in that ring like something carved from stone. He was 6'10". He weighed 300 pounds. He moved with a slow, dark power that made entire arenas go silent just from hearing his music begin. He wore darkness like a coat and made crowds believe in something supernatural just by walking through a curtain. The world believed he was untouchable. Wished the world was wrong, completely and entirely wrong. Behind the black hat and the long coat was a man named Mark Calaway, and Mark Calaway was collecting damage with every single performance, bit by bit, bump by bump, year after year after year. Every time the Deadman stood up and walked away looking invincible, the real man underneath was paying a toll that no crowd could see and no camera could catch. Like a financial loan with no repayment schedule, the interest was always building, the debt was always growing, and eventually, in ways both dramatic and invisible, everything came due. This is the story of 10 of the most painful moments in that career. 10 specific bumps that Mark Calaway has spoken about himself, in his own words. 10 moments that prove beyond any doubt that the Deadman was always human. We are counting them down from number 10 all the way to number 1. And by the time we reach the top of that list, you will fully understand exactly what it cost to spend 30 years performing as a character who simply could not be hurt. But before we begin counting, you need to understand the world this man was working inside. The Undertaker did not perform in an era that prioritized protecting its athletes. There were no ringside brain scan protocols. There were no mandatory rest periods for injuries. There were no early retirement conversations between management and performers. He worked in the old school era, a time when you maintained the illusion of the character at all costs, a time when showing pain in public was the same as failing at your job. A time when the only measure of a professional was whether they showed up and performed, no matter what the body was going through behind the scenes. That culture did not just shape Mark Calaway, it trapped him. It created a situation where admitting to injury was weakness, where asking for rest was failure, and where the character on screen was always more important than the human being underneath it. And that culture extracted a price from Mark Calaway that no one watching from the seats could ever fully calculate. Now we count.
How about when you returned like a gothic superhero in a mask? 95.
Yeah, so we had to figure out a way. So I had I'd had a match with Mabel.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of that match, I ended up, he was coming off of one rope as fast as he could, and I was coming off the other rope. And
Number 10, WrestleMania 9, 1993, Giant Gonzalez. There are bumps that shatter bones. There are bumps that tear muscle away from its anchoring point. And then there are moments that attack the body entirely from within, where nothing visible breaks, but everything suffers anyway. Hey, WrestleMania 9 was that kind of moment for Mark Calaway. He did not walk into that match with a fractured bone or a torn ligament that night. He walked in carrying a raging fever of 102 degrees and a full active case of the flu. The match took place in the desert heat of Las Vegas. The outdoor setting already made the air punishingly dry and thin on a normal day. The stage was hot, the environment was harsh, and inside all of that, Calaway had to wrestle a man who stood nearly 8 feet tall. That man was Giant Gonzalez. Every single movement in professional wrestling requires energy. Lifting, pivoting, falling and recovering, running the ropes, absorbing contact. All of it has a physical cost. Under normal conditions, a trained, healthy athlete manages those costs. Under a 102-degree fever, there are no normal conditions. When a fever of that severity means the body's already working far harder than it should just to regulate its own temperature and fight whatever is attacking it from within. Every movement costs more energy than it should. Every breath is shallower. The muscles tire at a faster rate. The heart is beating harder than it needs to. The mind begins to cloud at the edges. Add the dry desert air, pulling oxygen from lungs that are already struggling, and you have a body system operating on the very edge of total collapse. And Calaway had to do all of this in public, in full costume, in character, with no one in the audience having any idea. He described that match as the most physically miserable experience of his entire 30-year career. Not the most dangerous, not the most painful in terms of raw physical damage. The most miserable are because there is no dramatic crowd moment for fighting a fever in silence. There is no iconic image of a man breathing through burning lungs while performing. You just endure it, privately, alone, while thousands of people watch and see nothing except a large, powerful man doing his job professionally. He pushed his cardiovascular system to its absolute limit that night in Las Vegas. His lungs were burning. His legs were dragging. His body was sending every possible signal asking him to stop and rest. He did not stop. He did not rest. Because old school wrestling did not have sick days. You showed up. You worked. No matter what the body was saying to you. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Thousands of people in that arena that night had no idea. The commentary team had no idea. And the cameras showed nothing of the reality behind the performance. There was no announcement before the match explaining that this man had a raging fever and was performing in desert heat with compromised lungs and a body fighting infection. There was just the Undertaker walking to the ring, doing his job, perfectly maintaining the illusion while the reality quietly tore at him from the inside. This is where the true story of Mark Calaway begins. Not with a dramatic crash from a great height, not with a sickening crack that echoes through an arena, but with a man quietly grinding through a furnace while the world applauds the performance and sees nothing of the cost.
I didn't want to be I never wanted to be a parody of myself. And I really risked that at the end. And I had some matches that I think maybe at one point in my career, like they were bad, but there was like one point in my career I felt like I could take anything and turn it around.
Yeah.
Number 9, 1994. The spine begins to quietly break down. By 1994, Mark Calaway had been performing his signature moveset for several years, across hundreds of matches on hundreds of nights. The tombstone pile driver, the back bumps taken onto the canvas, the massive controlled falls that a 300-pound man executes when he goes down. On camera, these things look smooth. They look controlled. They look like the trained performance they are. But every single one of those landings sends force directly up through the human spine. Every time, not occasionally, every time. Hundreds of repetitions per year, stacked on top of each other across every show, every tour, every match across multiple years of performing. Spines are strong structures, but they have limits. They are not designed to absorb that kind of repetitive compressive force indefinitely, especially when the body generating it weighs 300 pounds. By 1994, the spine of Mark Calaway had taken more cumulative compression than it was built to handle. And it was not the result of one catastrophic night. It was the result of all of them together, combined, piled up like weight on a structure not designed for that load until the whole thing began to buckle under the pressure. The injury forced him off the road for 7 months. At that point in his career, 7 months away from performing was an extraordinary break. 7 months of rehabilitation, 7 months of core stabilization work, 7 months of trying to rebuild a support structure that had been ground down to almost nothing by simple, relentless repetition. The rest helped. The rehab rehabilitation helped, but the research is very clear on this. Spinal compression damage does not reverse itself. It slows. It becomes quieter for a period, but it does not go away. The disc degeneration that began in 1994 never stopped progressing. It simply waited between each new chapter for the next opportunity to accelerate. The business had decided that a 300-pound man would fall hard and fast onto a canvas hundreds of times per year. Nobody in that business ever stopped to ask what those falls were doing to the bones stacked along the center of his back. That was not a question old school wrestling asked. And Mark Calaway never volunteered the answer. He just kept falling. And the spine kept recording every single landing. Consider the mathematics of it. If he performed 200 nights per year and took an average of just 5 back bumps per night across those events, that is 1,000 individual spinal compressions in a single year alone. Across the years from 1990 to 1994, before the first major breakdown, the total number climbs into the thousands. Each one individually absorbed. Each one quietly filed away inside the bones and the discs of a spine that had never been designed to be a storage unit for that kind of punishment. The 7-month break slowed the process. It did not stop it. Nothing could stop it.
Was the Undertaker. Been around a long time. He was a guy, stand-up guy, leader of the locker room, and had a hellacious run. And I remember being down in New Orleans, there at number 30, and I was watching the match in the truck with Kevin Dunn, and beer in each hand. And this was a match that I had to watch. We got 2 badass competitors in the ring, and Brock Lesnar and Undertaker, and I had to see the finish.
Number 8, 1995, Mabel, the face shatters. If number 9 was about slow and invisible damage that built across years, number 8 was its complete and violent opposite. Number 8 happened in a single second, and number 8 nearly cost the Undertaker the sight in his right eye, permanently, forever. The year was 1995. The event was Survivor Series. His opponent was Mabel, a wrestler who weighed 500 pounds. A mistimed leg drop, now one that was intended to land on Calaway's chest, came down instead directly onto his face, right onto the eye socket. The weight of a 500-pound man redirected from the chest to the orbital bone. The orbital floor, the thin curved bone that sits beneath the eyeball and supports it from below, was destroyed on impact. Not cracked, not fractured in part, destroyed. Approximately 90% of that bone was gone in an instant. Calaway described the sensation at the moment of impact as a light bulb going off inside his head, followed immediately by total, spreading numbness across his entire face. But the real danger was not the pain. The real danger was the bone fragments left behind, because his optic nerve was resting directly on a jagged shard of the shattered orbital bone. If another impact had landed in the same area, that shard could have severed the nerve completely. He could have lost the sight in that eye permanently. No surgery, no recovery, just blindness. Gone. Surgeons had to operate to remove the fragments and then insert a prosthetic orbital floor, an artificial structure to replace the bone that had been completely obliterated. When he returned to the ring afterwards, Calaway wore a distinctive gray and white mask that covered the healing surgical area. That mask became iconic. Audiences recognized it. It was written about. It became part of the mythology of the character. What those audiences did not know was that the mask was deeply uncomfortable to wear for long periods. It limited his peripheral vision during a stretch of his career when he needed to be at his absolute best. It was not a creative choice. It was a medical device. The only barrier between his healing eye socket and another impact that could have ended his sight permanently. He wore it. He performed. He said nothing, because old school did not permit complaints about the cost of doing the job. Old school said you wear the mask, you get back in the ring, and you work. The 1995 injury did not just damage his face, it planted something else inside it. A ghost, a structural weakness, a vulnerability that would sit dormant for 15 years and then come back to complete the damage it had started.
For those of you who will remember the Monday Night Raw that preceded that promo, they did a vignette on Vince's plane with Mick Foley, where Mick Foley tore into Vince and Vince was just eating fruit and not paying attention to what Mick had to say. And Mick laid some pretty heavy on Vince, and Vince just blew it off and ignored him, in terms of, well, this is the way things are and I don't give a
Number 7, 1996. Concrete and Spine, The Boiler Room Brawl, Mick Foley. By 1996, The Undertaker was deep into a rivalry with Mankind, the character portrayed by Mick Foley. These two men did things in the context of professional wrestling that most human beings would never consider doing anywhere outside of it. They were willing to push the physical boundaries of the form further than almost anyone else. And in 1996, their war moved away from the ring entirely and onto a surface nobody in professional wrestling was designed to fall on. The Boiler Room Brawl, a match conducted on unpadded, completely unforgiving concrete floors. The concept was to make it look raw and authentic, and the way the production achieved that raw, authentic look was to actually place two large, heavy men on a concrete floor with almost no protection between their bodies and the ground. During the match, Calaway took a back body drop onto that concrete. He landed on his back, and the only thing between his spine and the ground was what the research describes as a paper-thin mat, something that would technically qualify as padding while providing almost none. That is not real protection. That is the appearance of protection. He recalled that the impact felt as though every single vertebra in his spine had compressed simultaneously, all of them at the same time. In one shattering moment of absorbed force, a 300-pound man landing backwards on concrete with nothing meaningful to absorb the kinetic energy of that fall sends a shockwave directly through the entire skeletal structure from the base of the spine upward. There is no spring, no give, no distribution of force across a surface designed to absorb it. Number 6, WrestleMania 13, 1997. A knife in the hip. Psycho Sid. WrestleMania is the biggest night of the year in professional wrestling. Nobody pulls out. And nobody calls in hurt. Nobody steps back because their body is not ready. Not even when it should. Not even when every physical indicator is telling them to stop and rest. The professional mandate of the era was absolute on this point. You do not take the night off for WrestleMania. Whatever state you are in, you compete. He described every single step taken during that match as feeling like a knife being twisted deep inside his hip. Not a dull ache, not manageable discomfort, a knife being twisted with every pivot, every lift, every time he had to shift his weight or absorb impact or carry his opponent through the mechanics of the match. The torn tissue inside sent pain signals that, in a sane environment, would have ended the performance immediately. They ended nothing. What made this night particularly devastating in its long-term effect was not simply the pain endured on the night itself, it was the compensation mechanism the body activated in response to that pain. When the body is protecting an injured area, it automatically shifts load elsewhere. It changes how you walk, how you stand, how you distribute weight during movement. For a 300-pound man, those altered movement patterns mean other parts of the body are suddenly carrying extra load they were not designed for. When his right hip took that extra load throughout that match, and it suffered for it in ways that only became fully apparent over the following years. The altered mechanics of how he moved after WrestleMania 13, the compensating patterns that his body adopted to protect the torn labrum and groin, directly accelerated the degeneration of his right hip. One night of stubborn, old-school professionalism sent consequences forward through every year that followed. Number 5, Hell in a Cell, 1998, Walking on Glass. Mick Foley, the 1998 Hell in a Cell match between The Undertaker and Mankind is one of the most famous matches in the history of professional wrestling. Most people who know it for what happened to Mick Foley. The fall from the top of the cage, the landing through the announce table, the moment that genuinely alarmed everyone watching, including the commentators. The images from that night have been shared and discussed and replayed for decades. But what is far less discussed is the condition Mark Calaway was already in before any of that happened, before the first bell rang, before he touched the cage. He entered that building with a fractured ankle. Not a sore ankle, not an ankle that was a little stiff from overuse, a fractured ankle, a bone that had broken. He could barely walk into the building before the match began, and he was about to climb a 20-foot chain link structure and balance on top of it while it shifted and moved beneath his weight. He recalled that every single step on top of that cage felt like walking on glass. The wire mesh surface was unstable. It sagged in places. It moved differently depending on where his weight fell, and every time an uneven section of the mesh pressed directly into the fracture site on his ankle, pain shot upward through his leg and into his body. He was balancing 300 pounds on a fractured bone on an unstable surface, 20 feet above the ring floor. When he eventually jumped down from the top of the cage into the ring, the impact of landing with his full body weight on an already fractured ankle caused additional bone chips to break free. The swelling was immediate and severe. He required medical attention directly after the match ended. But before that medical attention arrived, he had to stand in the ring. He had to continue the match.
WrestleMania 30.
WrestleMania 30. That's with Brock, right?
Yeah, after the
Yeah. So that
streak was broken.
Yeah, that was. So I got concussed somewhere in the first 5, maybe 10 minutes of that match. I've watched it back. I can't pick it out.
Do you remember that match?
No. My last memory of that day happened around 2:00 in the afternoon.
Wow.
To this day, my last memory is at 2:00. Michelle had come backstage to check on me, to see me, and then I told her, because I didn't know until like 30 minutes before that we were going to break the streak.
Number 4, 1999. Everything tears at once. There comes a point in every story of accumulated physical damage where the body simply stops cooperating, where it reaches the absolute end of its tolerance and refuses to keep absorbing more, where the debt becomes too large to keep deferring. For Mark Calaway, that point arrived in 1999. Not gradually, not over a series of months that allowed for adjustment. All at once, in what felt like the final collection notice from a decade of borrowed time. He suffered a torn pectoral muscle and a severely torn groin, both at the same time, both severe enough that ordinary people in ordinary lives would have stopped everything and begun many months of careful recovery. There was nothing ordinary about the situation Mark Calaway was in. The pectoral tear was especially serious for this particular performer. His entire offensive identity was built on upper body power. The choke slam required it. The striking required it. The power holds and the physical presence that made the character credible all required a functioning chest muscle. A torn pectoral did not just hurt, it removed his ability to perform at the level the character required. It stripped away part of what made the performance work. As the groin injury, a familiar companion by now, after WrestleMania 13 had first introduced it, was severe enough this time that Mark Calaway seriously sat down with the question of retirement.
What happened in the match with The Undertaker? You got knocked out.
I knocked
right?
myself out before walking to the freaking ring. When I came back, intensity is something very hard to replicate. And I had forgotten my sequence to the ring. I'd forgotten my preparation. It had been so long, and I had put it away. I had put it in a dark place in my mind. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get ready for matches anymore.
Number 3, 2004, the sickening pop, JBL. There is a sound that every athlete who has heard it never forgets. A sudden, sharp, sickening pop from somewhere inside the body. The kind of sound the human frame should never make. The kind that tells you immediately and without any ambiguity that something has gone badly wrong below the surface. Mark Calaway heard that sound in 2004. He was in the middle of a feud with JBL, John Bradshaw Layfield. Though the pop came from his ankle, not during a particularly high-risk sequence, not during a complex or dangerous maneuver, during a routine movement in the flow of a match. No warning, just a pop, and then immediate pain telling him exactly what the sound had already announced. The old school response to that sound was not to stop. The old school response was to make the injury worse by continuing. He reached down and tightened his boot around the ankle as hard as he possibly could. The boot became the brace. The compression of the leather against the damaged joint was the entirety of the medical intervention he gave himself. And then he finished the match. For months afterwards, he limped, not days, months. And throughout every one of those months, he maintained a full performance schedule. He traveled, he worked. He absorbed the physical demands that came with being the Undertaker on a full-time roster. On an ankle that had popped mid-match and been stuffed back into a boot, rather than placed in a medical setting for proper evaluation and rest. 2. 2010, Ed Burns and the Ghost of Mabel returns. Rey Mysterio. By 2010, The Undertaker had transitioned into a special attraction role within the company. Fewer matches, bigger occasions, higher stakes nights. But what those bigger occasions lacked in the frequency of regular performance, they made up for in a different kind of danger entirely. And 2010 delivered 2 moments that, in isolation, would each have been the defining physical story of an entire career. Together, they defined a single year. The first came at the Elimination Chamber event. Mark Calaway walked toward the ring in the way he always did, through the smoke and the darkness and the controlled pyrotechnic fire that had been part of the entrance ritual visual for years. The fire and the smoke were as recognizable as the hat and the coat, except this particular night, when one of those fires was not controlled, a pyrotechnic malfunction ignited the flames not in front of him or beside him, but directly beneath him. He was engulfed. First and second degree burns erupted across his chest, his neck, and both arms. He stood in that ring and smelled his own skin burning. He smelled his own hair burning. His skin was beginning to blister, beginning to bubble on the surface while he stood there, in front of an audience, in character. He removed his coat, which had been singed in the fire, and walked to his position in the match as though nothing had happened. He entered his plexiglass pod for the Elimination Chamber match, and he spent the next 20 minutes inside that pod pouring water over his chest and arms, not to clean himself, to stop the burns from spreading further, and to manage the pain of raw, open tissue exposed to the air around it. Then he wrestled for 20 more minutes, with first and second degree burns across the skin of his chest, neck, and arms. Number 1, WrestleMania 30, 2014, Brock Lesnar in Saudi Arabia, 2019, Goldberg. Number 1 is not a single isolated moment. Number 1 is 2 distinct moments separated by 5 years that together form the clearest picture of what waits at the absolute end of a road walk too long. What happens when the damage finally reaches somewhere that no boot can brace and no willpower can protect? What happens when the body finally presents the full bill? WrestleMania 30, 2014, the match against Brock Lesnar, on the most significant neurological event of Mark Calaway's entire 30-year career, and among the most serious injuries ever sustained by any performer in professional wrestling history. He suffered a severe concussion early in the match, not near the final moments, not after most of the contest had already played out, early, before the match had progressed through most of what it would eventually cover. The concussion was severe enough that his cognitive function was significantly compromised for the entire remainder of that evening. He had no memory of the match. None at all. Not the opening, not the middle, not the most historically significant single moment of the entire event, the moment that would be discussed and replayed and written about for years afterwards. He was not present for it mentally. His body was in the ring completing the movements. His mind was somewhere entirely unreachable. Vince McMahon left the arena during the main event. The head of the entire company walked away from his own biggest night of the year to go to the hospital with a man who had just wrestled through a brain injury. That single fact communicates the severity more clearly than any medical description could. The boss left his show because the man in the ring needed someone to be there. It was not until 4 in the morning that Calaway could remember his own name. Not 4 hours after the bell rang, not late that evening. 4 in the morning, he had competed, he had finished. He had been taken to a hospital, and he was sitting there at 4 in the morning, unable to access his own identity. That is what a severe concussion does to the human brain. That is what happens when a brain that has been inside a 300-pound body falling and absorbing impact for years finally absorbs more than it can process. This moment changed everything. It was the first time in his career that the question was not whether his joints or muscles would last, it was whether his mind would last. And the mind does not respond to stubbornness or old school pride. A severe concussion is not something you tape up and walk off. The brain requires time, it requires rest, and it is not a component that can be surgically replaced like a hip or a knee. The water would not reach the damage this time. Before we close, there are 2 things that never made the highlight reels but caused quiet, steady damage across decades. 2 moves the audience loved, 2 moves that the body quietly paid for hundreds of times every year. The old school rope walk. Every time the Undertaker balanced on that top rope and walked it for the crowd, he was placing 300 pounds on a thin, shifting cable. Every slip, every time an opponent pulled at him, his hip came down onto the hard steel frame of the ring, not the padded canvas, the steel frame itself. He described the repeated sensation as hitting a steel pipe again and again across hundreds upon hundreds of performances throughout his career. Those small, repeated traumas, each individually minor, accumulated across years to become one of the primary drivers behind his eventual need for hip resurfacing and then full hip replacement, the apron leg drop, the guillotine leg drop, where he would drop his leg across the throat of an opponent lying on the edge of the ring apron. The apron is solid, it has no spring, no give, no capacity to absorb any of the impact. When his hip and tailbone landed on that solid apron edge, it sent what he described as electrical shivers shooting directly up his spine, like being struck with a cattle prod, every single time he performed the move. That repeated impact across years is specifically credited with the final and complete destruction of his right hip through advanced osteoarthritis. The crowd saw an iconic finishing sequence. The spine felt a hammer hundreds of times. The total cost, and when everything was finally counted, at least 18 surgeries, 18 procedures to repair, reconstruct, and replace replace the components of a body that performed at the highest level for 30 consecutive years. His hips were the first major system to completely fail. He was one of the first high-profile athletes to undergo hip resurfacing, a procedure where a metal cap is placed over the femur head to reduce pain without performing a full replacement. That bought him additional years in the ring. But following his retirement match at WrestleMania 36, he required a total hip replacement operation to restore basic daily mobility. The temporary measure had finally run out of road. Both knees were replaced. Decades of landing on his knees at the conclusion of the tombstone piledriver had destroyed the cartilage in both joints entirely. After the knee replacements, he joked that he felt like a freaking giraffe learning to walk with joints that finally functioned without pain. 2 completely new knees, learning to run and move again. At the end of a 30-year career, both orbital sockets required surgical reconstruction, prosthetic floors inserted on both sides, multiple muscle surgeries, spinal procedures removing bone chips and decompressing nerves, ears, hands, and fingers repaired, reconstructed, and stabilized after fractures and lacerations. 18 surgeries confirmed the full anatomical debt of performing immortality inside a mortal body. Because if the Undertaker could work through it, there was no reason anyone else could not. This created a loop with no exit. He was the leader, so weakness was not permitted. Because weakness was not permitted, he stayed in the ring far past the point where his body should have stopped. Because he stayed in the ring, he sustained more damage than any other performer of that era. Because he sustained that damage, he required 18 surgeries to 2 orbital reconstructions, complete hip and knee replacements, and eventually a retirement that required him to rebuild his own ability to walk and move. He eventually admitted on his podcast, 6 Feet Under, that the struggle of his last 7 or 8 years in the ring was purely about his physical health. Not about passion, not about love for the craft. Those things were still present, but they were being constantly and relentlessly beaten back by a body that, by his own honest assessment, should have been allowed to retire a full decade before it actually did. The passion was willing, the body had a different vote, and eventually the body won the argument. So what do we finally make of Mark Calaway? He walked into WrestleMania 9 carrying a 102-degree fever and wrestled a man who was nearly 8 feet tall. He climbed a 20-foot cage with a fractured ankle and described every single step across that unstable surface as walking on glass. He stood in a burning ring with his skin actively blistering and poured water on his own chest for 20 minutes before going back out and finishing a match. He lay in a hospital at 4 in the morning, unable to access his own name. He was dropped on his head in extreme desert heat in front of thousands of people and had to sit quietly afterwards with the question he had been avoiding for 30 years. Through all of it, the crowd saw the Deadman, the hat, the coat, the slow, powerful walk down the aisle, the lights, the myth. They saw something that looked as though it could not be touched. They were watching the wrong story entirely. The real phenomenon was never the character. Yes, the real phenomenon was a human body surviving all of this and still standing. 18 surgeries, 30 years, 2 orbital fractures, thermal burns, a brain injury severe enough to take his own name away from him until 4 in the morning, bilateral knee and hip replacements to finally close the account. The professional wrestling industry has moved forward. There are ringside doctors now. There are mandatory concussion protocols. There are safeguards that did not exist when Mark Calaway was first learning to fall onto a canvas. His story is part of the reason those things now exist at all, because someone had to walk through that fire first. In the most literal and most complete sense of that phrase, the Deadman has been laid to rest forever, the iconic character is finished, and the long coat and the black hat have been set aside for the final time. But the physical legacy of Mark Calaway will continue for the rest of his life, in the way he walks every morning, in the rebuilt and replaced joints that carry him through each day, in the double vision that remains permanently in his eyes. He paid every pound of the price. He paid it in public, and he paid it in silence. He paid it with his bones and his muscles and his face and his mind and his spine and his memory. He paid it across 3 decades without ever once asking the crowd to understand the full cost of what they were watching. And in the end, the man who spent 30 years making the world believe he could never be broken proved something far more important than any character on any screen ever could. He proved what it truly and completely costs to appear unbreakable. He proved that the myth of the Deadman was never really about what he could do to an opponent. It was always entirely about what he was willing to endure himself, about what a human being will choose to absorb when they love something enough to keep paying for it, long after the price becomes unreasonable, long after the body says no, long after the sensible choice is clear, and no one in that ring, in that era, in the entire history of that beloved, brutal, unforgiving business has ever endured more, not even close.